Millbrook, Vermont, October 2024. A woman stepped off the Greyhound bus into the crisp autumn air, her breath forming small clouds as she surveyed the quaint New England town spread before her. The maple trees lining Main Street blazed with scarlet and gold, their leaves drifting down like nature's confetti onto the sidewalks, where tourists snapped photos of the picturesque covered bridge. She clutched a manila folder containing what she believed was her salvation, a job offer from Grinned Mountain Consulting, promising remote work flexibility and a fresh start in this peaceful corner of Vermont. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But as she walked toward the address listed in her employment packet, Sarah Mitchell would discover that sometimes the most beautiful traps are the ones hidden in plain sight. What awaited her would shatter her carefully constructed new identity and thrust her into an alliance with a man whose own scars ran deeper than the mountains surrounding this deceptively tranquil town. The October afternoon sun slanted through the canopy of sugar maples as Sarah adjusted the strap of her worn leather messenger bag and checked the address on her phone one more time. 47 Elm Street should have been just around the corner from the town's central green, according to the GPS that had guided her from the bus station. She had traveled nearly 400 miles from her cramped studio apartment in Albany, leaving behind a life that had become too dangerous to maintain, seeking refuge in what the job posting had described as a forward-thinking environmental consulting firm specializing in sustainable rural development. Sarah had researched Grinned Mountain Consulting extensively before accepting their offer. Their website showcased impressive projects across New England, complete with professional headshots of a diverse team and glowing testimonials from satisfied clients. The salary they offered was generous enough to allow her to disappear completely from her former life, while the remote work component meant she could maintain the low profile that had kept her alive for the past 18 months. After what had happened to Marcus, after the threats that forced her to abandon her cybersecurity career and go underground, this opportunity seemed like a gift from whatever angels watched over whistleblowers. The streets of Millbrook carried the lingering scent of wood smoke from early evening fires, mixed with the sweet decay of fallen leaves. Victorian houses lined the residential blocks, their wraparound porches decorated with pumpkins and corn stalks in anticipation of Halloween. Children's laughter echoed from somewhere nearby, a sound so normal and peaceful that Sarah felt some of the tension in her shoulders begin to ease for the first time in months. This was exactly the kind of place where someone like her could vanish into small-town anonymity, blend into the fabric of a community where people minded their own business and strangers were welcomed with cautious but genuine warmth. She found Elm Street without difficulty, a tree-lined avenue of modest homes dating from the early 20th century. The house numbers climbed steadily as she walked, 35, 39, 43, 45. But where number 47 should have stood, Sarah discovered only an empty lot overgrown with weeds and brambles. A rusted for sale sign tilted at a precarious angle near the sidewalk, its paint so faded that the realtor's information was barely legible. The lot appeared to have been vacant for years, possibly decades, judging by the mature sumac and wild rose bushes that had claimed the space. Sarah pulled out her phone and double-checked the address in the employment email from Grinned Mountain Consulting. The coordinates matched exactly. She walked the entire block twice, thinking perhaps she had miscounted or missed an obscure entrance, but there was no mistake. The address where she was supposed to report for her first day of work simply did not exist. A cold realization began to settle in her stomach like a stone dropping into still water. Sarah opened her phone's browser and navigated back to the Grinned Mountain Consulting website. But instead of the polished corporate site she had bookmarked weeks earlier, she found only an error message. This domain is no longer active. She tried variations of the company name, searched for their supposed projects, even looked up the professional credentials of the executives whose biographies she had memorized. Nothing. It was as if Green Mountain Consulting had never existed at all. The implications crashed over her in waves. The job offer that had seemed too good to be true was exactly that. Someone had created an elaborate facade specifically to lure her to this remote Vermont town, far from the protective anonymity of urban crowds. The sophisticated website, the detailed job description that perfectly matched her cybersecurity background, even the salary figure that was generous enough to convince her to relocate immediately, all of it had been carefully calculated bait. In a trap she had walked into with desperate enthusiasm. Sarah's hand instinctively moved to the small of her back, where a compact Glock 43 rested in a concealed holster beneath her jacket. Marcus had insisted she learn to shoot after they decided to expose North Point Industries' defense contract fraud. "These people don't play games," he had told her during their weekend trips to the firing range. "If they decide you're a threat, they'll come at you with everything they have." She had thought he was being paranoid until the brake lines on his car were cut, until the accident that killed him became the motivation for her to disappear completely from her former life. The autumn air suddenly felt much colder against her skin as Sarah considered her options. The return bus to Albany wouldn't depart until tomorrow morning, leaving her stranded overnight in a town where someone had specifically arranged for her to be vulnerable and isolated. She had perhaps $300 in cash, enough for a motel room and meals, but not enough to disappear again if this trap was already closing around her. Her cryptocurrency accounts contained the FBI whistleblower reward money that represented her only path to genuine financial independence. But accessing those funds would require secure internet and privacy that seemed increasingly unlikely to find. Sarah began walking back toward Main Street, her mind racing through possibilities and contingencies. She needed to assess the threat level, determine whether she was dealing with corporate security contractors or something more dangerous, and most importantly, find a way to get out of Millbrook before whoever had orchestrated this deception made their next move. The picturesque autumn town now felt like a stage set designed specifically for her destruction. Every quaint storefront and friendly local face potentially part of an elaborate performance, meant to keep her distracted until the real players revealed themselves. The main commercial district of Millbrook stretched for perhaps 6 blocks along Route 4, a mix of businesses catering to both locals and the steady stream of tourists drawn by Vermont's famous fall foliage. Murphy's General Store anchored one end of the strip, its wooden sign advertising everything from soup to nuts since 1892, while the Riverside Diner occupied a converted railroad car at the other end, its neon sign promising home cooking and friendly faces. Between them, Sarah counted a handful of shops selling maple syrup and local crafts, a small pharmacy, a single-screen movie theater, and what appeared to be the town's only gas station. She also noticed Coleman's Auto Repair, a 2-bay garage set back from the road behind a gravel lot crowded with vehicles in various states of disrepair. The building itself looked like it had been constructed sometime in the 1960s, its concrete block walls painted a faded blue that had probably been cheerful once upon a time. Hand-lettered signs in the windows advertised services ranging from oil changes to engine rebuilds, while a larger banner stretched across the front proclaimed, "Honest work, fair prices, guaranteed satisfaction." Sarah's attention was drawn to the garage, not by any particular interest in automotive repair, but by the man who emerged from beneath the raised hood of a pickup truck as she passed. He appeared to be in his mid-30s with the kind of lean that spoke of physical work rather than gym workouts. Dark hair showed traces of premature gray at the temples, and when he turned to retrieve a tool from a nearby workbench, she noticed he moved with a slight limp that suggested an old injury. His clothes were appropriately stained with oil and coolant, but something about the way he carried himself, a certain alertness in his posture, made Sarah wonder if auto repair was his only profession. Their eyes met briefly as she walked past the garage entrance, and Sarah saw him take note of her obvious status as a newcomer to town. His expression was curious rather than threatening, the kind of polite interest rural communities typically showed toward strangers, but she also detected a hint of wariness that suggested he was accustomed to evaluating potential threats. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The moment stretched as long enough to become noticeable before Sarah looked away and continued walking, but she filed away the encounter as potentially significant. In a town this small, everyone would know within hours that a stranger had arrived on the afternoon bus, and questions would inevitably follow about her purpose and duration of stay. The Millbrook Inn occupied a 3-story, Victorian mansion that had been converted into a bed and breakfast sometime during the tourism boom of the 1980s. Its wraparound porch was decorated with carved pumpkins and corn shocks, while a discreet sign by the front steps advertised comfortable rooms, full breakfast, reasonable rates. Sarah climbed the porch steps and pushed through the front door into a lobby that managed to balance historical authenticity with modern convenience. The woman behind the reception desk appeared to be in her 60s, with silver hair pulled back into a neat bun and wire-rimmed glasses that gave her a librarian-like appearance. She looked up from a ledger book as Sarah approached, her smile warm but professionally measured. "Good afternoon," she said in the kind of accent that spoke of generations in northern New England. "I'm Helen Morrison. Are you looking for a room?" "Yes, please," Sarah replied, trying to project casual confidence despite the growing anxiety about her situation. "Just for one night, I hope. I'm supposed to start a new job tomorrow, but there seems to have been some confusion about the office location." Helen's eyebrows rose slightly at this information. "A new job here in Millbrook? That's wonderful. We don't get many new residents, especially young professionals. May I ask what kind of work?" Sarah had prepared a cover story, but now it felt inadequate given the complete fabrication of Green Mountain Consulting. "Environmental consulting," she said, keeping her response deliberately vague. "I'm hoping to sort out the details in the morning." "How interesting," Helen replied, though her expression suggested polite skepticism rather than genuine curiosity. "I can't think of any consulting firms in town, but perhaps it's something new. Our rate is $85 per night, including breakfast. Will that work for you?" The price was reasonable, and Sarah handed over cash to avoid creating any electronic trail that might be useful to whoever was tracking her. Helen provided a registration form that requested standard information, but Sarah noticed her studying the false name and Albany address with the kind of attention that suggested she would remember the details later. In a community this small, the innkeeper would likely be one of the primary sources of information about visitors and temporary residents. Her room on the second floor was clean and comfortable, with a view of the town green through lace curtains that belonged to an earlier era of hospitality. Sarah locked the door behind her and immediately began a security assessment of her temporary shelter. The windows could be opened, but were too high above the ground for easy escape. The room's location at the front of the building made it visible from the street, while the thin walls would provide little protection against anyone determined to reach her. Most concerning of all, the inn's guest registry now contained her current alias, information that would be easily accessible to anyone claiming to be a friend or colleague looking for her. Sarah opened her laptop and connected to the inn's Wi-Fi network, immediately running a series of security checks to ensure her communications remained encrypted and untraceable. Her first priority was confirming that the Green Mountain Consulting deception was as complete as it appeared. Using advanced search techniques learned during her cybersecurity career, she probed for any digital footprint that might have survived the website's disappearance. What she discovered was even more disturbing than simple fraud. The domain registration for Green Mountain Consulting had been purchased with a cryptocurrency payment just 6 weeks earlier, suggesting the entire operation was specifically designed to target her personally. The website's construction showed professional-level attention to detail, complete with realistic employee profiles that were actually composites created from stock photography and public LinkedIn data. Most tellingly, the job posting that had attracted her attention had been crafted using keywords and requirements that precisely matched her background and current situation, indicating whoever was behind this deception had intimate knowledge of her skills and circumstances. Further investigation revealed that similar fake companies had been created and dissolved over the past 18 months, each one appearing to target individuals with specialized technical backgrounds who might pose threats to certain corporate interests. The pattern suggested a systematic effort to identify and neutralize whistleblowers, journalists, and activists who had access to sensitive information or the skills to expose corporate wrongdoing. Sarah's case appeared to be part of a much larger operation. The realization that she was dealing with a sophisticated adversary rather than simple corporate security brought a new level of urgency to her situation. Marcus had warned her that Northpoint Industries had connections throughout the defense establishment and unlimited resources for eliminating threats to their lucrative government contracts. His death had been arranged to look like an accident precisely because direct assassination would have drawn unwanted attention to their criminal activities. The fake job offer represented a more subtle approach: isolate the target in a remote location where disappearance could be explained as personal choice rather than foul play. Sarah closed her laptop and moved to the window, carefully observing the street below for any signs of surveillance. The autumn afternoon was fading toward evening, and Main Street showed the normal activity of a small town preparing for dinner and an early evening at home. A few teenagers walked past carrying school backpacks, while an elderly man walked a small dog that seemed far more interested in the investigation of fallen leaves than forward progress. Nothing appeared immediately threatening, but Sarah knew that professional surveillance would be invisible to casual observation. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Kate, hope you arrived safely. Looking forward to meeting you tomorrow at the office. Let me know if you need anything tonight." The message was signed David Chen, Green Mountain Consulting, but Sarah had registered at the inn under the name Kate Wilson, and she had never communicated with anyone named David Chen. Someone was monitoring her movements closely enough to know exactly when she had arrived in Millbrook and what false identity she was currently using. The trap was closing faster than she had anticipated. Sarah quickly packed her few belongings back into her messenger bag and prepared to leave the inn immediately. Her original plan to wait for the morning bus now seemed impossibly naive. Whoever had arranged this deception would act tonight while she was isolated and vulnerable. Her only chance lay in getting out of Millbrook before they made their final move, even if it meant walking along dark country roads until she could find alternative transportation. Sarah was reaching for the door handle when she heard footsteps in the hallway outside her room, deliberate and purposeful rather than the casual movement of other guests. She froze, listening carefully as the steps paused directly outside her door. A soft knock followed, polite but insistent. "Ms. Wilson?" The voice was male, professionally pleasant, with no trace of regional accent. "I'm David Chun from Green Mountain Consulting. I was hoping we could chat briefly about tomorrow's orientation." Sarah's hand moved instinctively toward the concealed pistol while her mind raced through options. The man outside her door was almost certainly not David Chun, just as Green Mountain Consulting was not a real company. This was the moment she had been dreading since Marcus's death, when her careful anonymity would be stripped away and she would have to fight for her life against enemies with resources and ruthlessness far beyond anything she could match. "Sorry," she called through the door, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm not feeling well this evening." Perhaps we could meet in the morning at the office instead." "I'm afraid that won't be possible," the voice replied, and now Sarah detected a hint of menace beneath the professional courtesy. "We really do need to speak tonight. I have some paperwork that requires your immediate attention." The doorknob turned slowly, testing the lock that Sarah had secured upon entering the room. When it held firm, the turning motion stopped, but she could hear the man remain outside her door. He was no longer bothering to maintain the pretense of being a legitimate business contact. The hunt that had begun 18 months earlier with Marcus's murder was finally reaching its conclusion in this quiet Vermont inn. Sarah moved away from the door and opened the room's single window, looking down at the porch roof that extended. Below, the drop from there to the ground would be manageable, though she would have to move quickly before the man outside her door summoned assistance or found another way into the room. Her hands shook slightly as she gathered her belongings. The adrenaline of imminent danger fighting against the training that Marcus had insisted she master during their final months together. The sound of metal against metal from the hallway told her that someone was working on the lock, using tools that suggested professional training rather than improvised breaking and entering. Sarah had perhaps minutes before her temporary shelter would be compromised. She threw her messenger bag over her shoulder and climbed out onto the porch roof, her sneakers sliding slightly on the painted shingle still damp from the afternoon's brief rain shower. The jump to the ground was harder than it appeared from above, and Sarah landed awkwardly, pain shooting through her ankle as she rolled to absorb the impact. She forced herself to her feet and began running toward the street, hoping to reach the relative safety of public spaces before her pursuers realized she had escaped through the window. Behind her, she could hear the sound of splintering wood as someone forced their way into her abandoned room. Sarah's ankle throbbed with each step, but she maintained her pace as she ran down Main Street toward the only business that still showed lights in its windows. Coleman's Auto Repair was still open despite the late hour, and she could see the mechanic she had noticed earlier working beneath the hood of the same pickup truck. Her choices were limited. She could try to hide among the buildings and hope to evade capture until morning, or she could trust a stranger whose only qualification was his availability when she desperately needed help. The sound of car doors slamming behind her made the decision easier. Sarah limped quickly across the gravel lot toward the open garage bay, where the mechanic looked up in surprise at her urgent approach. "Please," she gasped, glancing back toward the street where dark figures were emerging from vehicles. "I need help. There are people trying to hurt me." The mechanic straightened slowly, his gaze moving from Sarah's frightened face to the approaching figures, then back to her with an expression that suggested he was rapidly assessing a dangerous situation. For a moment that seemed to stretch forever, Sarah wondered if she had just traded one threat for another. If this small-town auto repair shop was itself part of the elaborate trap that had been constructed around her. Then the mechanic smiled, an expression that transformed his weathered features and revealed something that looked remarkably like anticipation rather than fear. "Ma'am," he said in a voice that carried traces of military training beneath its Vermont drawl, "sounds like you've brought me exactly the kind of trouble I've been looking for." Dave Coleman had been working late on the Henderson pickup when the woman came running across his lot like her life depended on it. In the 15 years since he'd returned from Afghanistan, he'd developed an instinct for recognizing genuine fear versus the manufactured drama that sometimes accompanied small-town disputes. This woman's terror was authentic, and the way she kept glancing over her shoulder toward Main Street suggested she wasn't running from an angry boyfriend or unpaid debt. The three men emerging from the black sedan parked near Murphy's General Store moved with the kind of coordinated precision that Dave recognized from his military days. They weren't local law enforcement, weren't private investigators, and they certainly weren't concerned citizens responding to a disturbance. These were professionals, and their unhurried confidence suggested they expected to complete their business without interference from the local authorities. Dave set down his wrench and stepped forward, positioning himself between the woman and the approaching figures. His right hand moved instinctively toward the small of his back, where a Sig Sauer P320 rested in a concealed holster beneath his work shirt. Old habits from Kandahar died hard, even in rural Vermont. "Ma'am," he said quietly, keeping his voice calm despite the adrenaline beginning to course through his system. "You can tell me what's happening, or you can just stand behind me and let me handle this. Either way, those men aren't getting past this garage without a conversation." Sarah studied his face in the harsh fluorescent light of the garage, searching for signs of deception or hidden agenda. What she saw was a man who had clearly made his own peace with violence, someone who understood that certain situations required direct action rather than diplomacy. His steady gaze and relaxed posture suggested he was exactly what he appeared to be, a small-town mechanic who happened to have the skills and willingness to stand between her and whatever threat was approaching from the street. "They're not police," she said, her voice still breathless from the run across town. "They work for people who want to hurt me because of something I exposed about government contracts. I thought I was safe here, but it was all a setup." Dave nodded as if corporate assassination attempts were routine occurrences in Millbrook. "How many more where these came from?" "I don't know. Could be dozens. They have resources and connections I can't match." "Resources are overrated," Dave replied with the kind of casual confidence that came from surviving situations where superior firepower hadn't guaranteed victory. "Sometimes all you need is home field advantage and a willingness to make things messy." The lead figure from the sedan had reached the edge of the garage lot, close enough now that Dave could see his expensive suit and the careful way he moved, to avoid stepping in the oil stains that dotted the gravel. The man's smile was professionally pleasant, the expression of someone accustomed to solving problems through a combination of authority and implied threat. "Excuse me," the man called out, his voice carrying the kind of educated accent that marked him as an outsider in this rural community. "We're looking for a woman who may have been in some kind of accident. We're concerned about her welfare." Dave glanced at Sarah, noting the way she instinctively moved deeper into the shadows cast by the overhead work lights. Whatever these people wanted with her, it wasn't a welfare check. "Haven't seen any accidents tonight," Dave replied, wiping his hands on a shop rag with deliberate slowness. "This is a quiet town. We tend to notice when something unusual happens." The man's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "I'm sure you understand our concern. She may be confused, possibly suffering from a medical condition that affects her judgment. It's important that we locate her quickly for her own safety." "Medical condition," Dave repeated thoughtfully. "That sounds serious. You must be family then. Or maybe doctors. We're associates from her workplace. She missed an important meeting today, and we're worried she may have had some kind of episode." Dave stepped forward slightly, and Sarah noticed that his limp became more pronounced when he moved quickly. Whatever injury had damaged his leg was significant enough to affect his mobility, but it didn't seem to diminish his confidence in handling the current situation. "Associates," Dave said, as if testing the word. "From her workplace. That would be Green Mountain Consulting, I suppose." The man's expression flickered with surprise before returning to its professional neutrality. "You're familiar with the company?" "Small town," Dave replied with a shrug. "Word gets around when someone new is supposed to start working locally. Funny thing, though. I've lived here my whole life, and I've never heard of any consulting company operating out of Millbrook. Makes a man wonder what kind of consulting requires such nice suits and expensive cars." The two other figures had spread out slightly, positioning themselves to flank the garage entrance. Their movements were subtle but unmistakable to anyone with tactical training. They were preparing for the possibility that their polite approach might need to become something more direct. Sarah pressed herself against the workbench behind Dave, her hand moving toward the concealed pistol she carried. The weapon felt inadequate against three professionals who clearly had backup and resources, but it was better than facing them completely defenseless. "Mr. The lead figure prompted, obviously seeking Dave's name. "Coleman. Dave Coleman. I own this place. Mr. Coleman, I appreciate your concern for your community, but this is really a private matter between colleagues. If you could just step aside and allow us to speak with Kate, we'll be out of your hair in no time." The use of her false name confirmed that these men had been tracking her movements since she arrived in Millbrook. They knew exactly who she was, where she had gone, and probably what resources she had available. The elaborate deception with Green Mountain Consulting had been designed specifically to isolate her in this remote location where local law enforcement would be minimal and escape routes limited. Dave shifted his weight slightly, a movement that brought him closer to the tool cart where Sarah could see several heavy wrenches within easy reach. "Here's the thing," he said conversationally. "I'm not in the business of handing scared women over to strangers, no matter how official they claim to be," Dave said flatly. "Especially not when they show up in rental cars after dark." "This doesn't concern you, Mr. Coleman," the lead man replied, his voice clipped. "She came to me for help in my garage," Dave said. "That makes it my concern." The man's professional facade was beginning to crack, his expression hardening into the kind of cold focus Sarah had only seen in her worst nightmares. These men weren't just here for a conversation. They'd been sent with a mission, and they were getting tired of delays. "Mr. Coleman," the lead man said, tone sharpening, "I think you're misunderstanding the situation. Kate is a trusted employee who's been under considerable strain. She's made some regrettable choices that we're trying to help her fix before they escalate." Dev raised an eyebrow. "You mean like uncovering criminal operations by defense contractors?" The words hit like a challenge. Sarah could tell Dave had figured out more than she'd told him. Whether it was instinct or experience with this sort of threat, he clearly grasped the danger. The man's polite mask dropped completely now. "You're interfering in a lawful business matter. I suggest you think carefully before getting further involved." Dave didn't flinch. "I have thought about it. And here's what I see. You're trespassing, threatening a woman who asked me for help, and acting like people who shouldn't be trusted with anyone's safety." Sarah noticed the way the three men exchanged subtle, silent signals. She'd seen this kind of coordination before in security briefings, right before things turned violent. "Dave," she said softly, using his name for the first time. "These men killed my partner when he tried to reveal the same information I have. They won't think twice about killing you too." He didn't react outwardly, but she saw the shift in his posture, no longer just alert, but ready. "Ma'am, I appreciate the warning," Dave said calmly, "but I've been shot at by better men in worse places than Vermont. If they want to escalate, that's their call." The lead man reached into his jacket. Dave moved quickly, grabbing a hefty steel breaker bar from a nearby tool cart. Not a gun, but deadly in the right hands. "Gentlemen," he said, voice firm, "you can take this up with the Millbrook Police, the Vermont State Police, or the FBI. Take your pick. But this woman is under my protection until real authorities sort this out." "There are three of us, Mr. Coleman," one of them said. Dave gave a tight, humorless smile. It wasn't polite, it was the expression of someone who'd faced real violence and didn't fear it. "I know how to count," he said. "The question is whether you know how to think. This is a small town. People notice things. Three outsiders harassing a local woman at night is going to raise questions. And if you're thinking about forcing the issue, you should know I've got cameras recording everything, and the footage gets uploaded to a cloud server the sheriff can access." Sarah followed his gaze and saw the security cameras blinking, red in the corners. Whether Dave was bluffing or not, it made things riskier for her pursuers. They clearly hadn't planned for resistance, especially not from someone prepared and unafraid to confront them. They'd probably expected a quiet extraction, no witnesses. Dave had thrown that plan off course. After a tense pause, the lead man gave a small signal, and his team began retreating toward their car. "You're making a big mistake, Mr. Coleman," he said coldly. "Kate is mixed up in operations that pose a real threat to national security. The people she's working with are dangerous. By shielding her, you're endangering yourself and your town." Dave's eyes narrowed. "Is that so? Funny, because from where I'm standing, this looks a lot like corporate murder being passed off as patriotism. I've seen real threats to national security, and they didn't wear designer suits or drive rental cars." The man didn't respond, just stared, then turned and got into the vehicle. But Dave's stance didn't relax. Not until the car was gone. "Coleman." "No," Dave agreed. "It's not. But it's not going to be resolved tonight. And it's not going to be resolved on my property without proper legal documentation and law enforcement oversight." The three men reached their sedan and climbed inside, but they didn't drive away immediately. Through the windshield, Sarah could see them engaged in intense discussion, probably calling their superiors for instructions on how to handle the unexpected complication of local resistance. Dave set the breaker bar back on the tool cart, but kept himself positioned between Sarah and the street. "They'll be back," he said matter-of-factly. "Probably with more people and better planning. Question is what you want to do about it." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and growing anxiety as she considered her options. Dave's intervention had bought her time, but it had also escalated the situation in ways that might ultimately make things worse for both of them. The corporate enforcers would report back to their superiors that their target had found local protection, which would likely result in a more aggressive approach that could endanger innocent people in Millbrook. "I should leave," she said finally. "Get out of town before they bring reinforcements. You've done enough already." Dave shook his head. "They've seen you with me now. Even if you disappear tonight, they'll assume I know something about where you went or what information you have. Besides, you're injured." He gestured toward her ankle, which was beginning to swell noticeably inside her sneaker. Sarah had been ignoring the pain from her jump off the inn's porch roof, but now that the immediate danger had passed, the throbbing was becoming difficult to dismiss. She tested her weight on the injured joint and winced at this sharp protest. That shot up her leg. "It's not that bad," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Ma'am, I've seen enough injuries to know when someone's trying to tough through something that needs medical attention. You're not walking out of Millbrook tonight, and even if you could, they'd track you down before you got 10 miles. The black sedan was still parked across the street, its occupants clearly maintaining surveillance while they waited for new instructions. Sarah realized that Dave was probably right about her inability to escape on foot, and the presence of the watchers meant that conventional transportation would be equally impossible. "So what do you suggest?" she asked. Dave glanced toward the sedan, then back at Sarah with an expression that suggested he was weighing several unpalatable options. "Short term, we get you somewhere safe where you can rest that ankle and figure out your next move. Long term, we need to understand exactly what kind of resources these people have and how far they're willing to go." "I can tell you that right now," Sarah replied grimly. "They have unlimited resources and they'll go as far as necessary to eliminate anyone who threatens their defense contracts. They killed Marcus, and they'll kill both of us without hesitation if they think it serves their interests." Dave nodded as if she had confirmed something he had already suspected. "In that case, we need to level the playing field. Can't outgun them, can't outspend them, but we might be able to outthink them." Sarah studied his weathered face, noting the confidence in his voice despite the overwhelming odds they faced. There was something about Dave Coleman that suggested he had dealt with impossible situations before and found ways to survive them. Whether that experience would be sufficient to handle corporate assassins remained to be seen, but it was more hope than she had possessed an hour earlier. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. "You don't know me, don't know what I've done or what I'm involved in. For all you know, everything they said about me could be true." Dave's expression grew thoughtful as he considered the question. "Couple reasons," he said finally. "First, I've got a pretty good ability to read people, and you don't strike me as someone who threatens national security. You strike me as someone who tried to do the right thing and got in over her head with people who have more power than conscience. And second, Dave's smile returned, but this time it carried a hint of something that might have been anticipation. I spent the last 15 years fixing other people's cars and trying to convince myself that was enough purpose for one lifetime. Tonight, for the first time since I got back from Afghanistan, I feel like I'm doing something that actually matters." The corporate sedan across the street started its engine and began moving slowly down Main Street, but Sarah noticed it turned into the parking lot of the Riverside Diner rather than leaving town. They were repositioning for extended surveillance, not abandoning their assignment. "They're settling in for a long wait," she observed. "Good," Dave replied. "That gives us time to make some plans." He walked to a panel beside the garage's main entrance and pressed a button that activated the overhead doors, sealing them inside the work bays. The sound of the heavy doors closing felt like a declaration of intent, a signal that Dave Coleman had chosen his side in whatever conflict was developing between Sarah and her corporate pursuers. "First things first," he said, returning to where Sarah stood beside the workbench. "Let's take a look at that ankle." Sarah allowed him to help her onto a rolling stool, then removed her sneaker to reveal a joint that was swollen and beginning to show the purple discoloration of serious bruising. Dave examined the injury with gentle competence, his calloused hand surprisingly careful as he tested for broken bones. "Sprain, not a fracture," he diagnosed. "Painful, but it'll heal. We need to get some ice on it and wrap it properly." He disappeared into a small office adjoining the main garage and returned with a first aid kit that was considerably more comprehensive than Sarah had expected to find in an automotive repair shop. As he worked to stabilize her ankle with professional-grade elastic bandages, she found herself studying his movements and noting details that suggested his medical knowledge extended beyond basic first aid. "Military training?" she asked. "Combat medic before I became a mechanic," Dave confirmed without looking up from his work. "Turns out a lot of the same principles apply whether you're fixing people or fixing engines. Find the problem, understand how the system works, apply the right tools in the right sequence. Is that how you see this situation? Something that can be fixed?" Dave finished wrapping her ankle and sat back to evaluate his work. "Everything can be fixed if you're willing to replace enough parts," he said. "Question is whether you want to repair the original system or build something completely new." Sarah wasn't certain whether he was speaking literally about her injury or metaphorically about her larger predicament, but either interpretation suggested a level of optimism that she hadn't felt since Marcus's death. For the first time in 18 months, she had found someone who seemed willing and able to help her fight back against the forces that had been hunting her. "Dave," she said carefully, "if you're serious about helping me, there are things you need to know about what we're up against. This isn't just corporate security trying to silence a whistleblower. This is a multi-billion-dollar defense contract. That involves people with connections throughout the government and intelligence communities. They have resources that most people can't even imagine." "Tell me," Dave replied simply, so Sarah told him. She explained about North Point Industries and their systematic fraud involving defense contracts worth billions of taxpayer dollars. She described the sophisticated money laundering schemes that funneled profits to offshore accounts while delivering substandard equipment to American soldiers. She detailed the evidence that she and Marcus had gathered and the brutal efficiency with which the company had eliminated him when he attempted to go public with their discoveries. Dave listened without interruption, his expression growing more serious as Sarah described the scope of the criminal enterprise they were challenging. When she finished, he sat quietly for several minutes, obviously processing the implications of what she had revealed. "This evidence," he said finally. "Do you still have it?" Sarah nodded toward her messenger bag. "Everything Marcus died for is in encrypted files on secured servers. Financial records, communications between executives, documentation of the substandard materials they've been using in armor and communications equipment. Enough to put dozens of people in prison and cost North Point their government contracts. Then why haven't you released it?" "Because they'll kill me the moment I do. And without someone alive to testify about the technical details, good lawyers will find ways to discredit or dismiss the evidence. Marcus thought he could stay alive long enough to see it through the legal system. He was wrong." Dave stood and walked to one of the windows facing Main Street, carefully peering through the blinds toward the diner where the corporate surveillance team had established their position. "How much is this whistleblower reward worth?" Sarah hesitated, then decided that complete honesty was necessary if she expected Dave to continue risking his life for her. $180,000, plus whatever damages might be recovered through civil litigation. Dave whistled softly. "That's serious money. It's also completely worthless if I'm dead." "Not necessarily," Dave replied thoughtfully. "Money like that properly invested could provide security and independence that would make it a lot harder for them to reach you. Question is whether you're willing to take the risks necessary to claim it." Sarah studied his profile as he continued, watching the street, noting the way his jaw had tightened as he considered their options. There was something about Dave Coleman that suggested he was accustomed to calculating odds and making decisions based on incomplete information, skills that had probably kept him alive during his military service. "What are you thinking?" she asked. Dave turned away from the window and faced her directly. "I'm thinking that 3 corporate enforcers sitting in a diner doesn't constitute overwhelming force. I'm thinking that small towns have advantages that cities don't, including people who ask questions when strangers start causing trouble for locals. And I'm thinking that you've spent the last 18 months running from these people instead of figuring out how to make them run from you. You're talking about fighting back." "I'm talking about winning," Dave corrected. "There's a difference. Running and hiding might keep you alive for a while, but it won't stop them from coming after you. Fighting back without a plan to win will just get you killed faster. But winning, that changes everything." Sarah felt a stirring of something she hadn't experienced since Marcus's death, hope that her situation might actually be survivable. Dave's confidence was infectious, and his military background suggested he might actually have the skills necessary to help her turn the tables on her pursuers. "What would winning look like?" she asked. Dave's smile returned, and this time it carried the kind of anticipation that made Sarah think he had been waiting for exactly this kind of challenge. "Winning looks like North Point Industries in federal prison, their defense contracts canceled, and you collecting that reward money while living safely under your own name instead of hiding behind false identities. And you think that's actually possible?" "Ma'am," Dave replied, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who had survived impossible situations before. "I think it's not only possible, I think it's exactly the kind of good trouble I've been looking for." The clock above Dave's workbench read 11:30 when Sarah finally allowed exhaustion to overtake her vigilance. She had been running on adrenaline and determination for so long that her body was beginning to rebel against the constant state of alertness. Dave had fashioned a makeshift bed from clean shop rags and a sleeping bag he kept in his office, positioning it in the corner of the garage where she would be hidden from view, but could still hear anyone attempting to enter the building. Dave himself showed no signs of fatigue despite the late hour and the day's revelations. He moved around the garage with quiet efficiency, checking security measures and preparing equipment that Sarah suspected had nothing to do with automotive repair. The military discipline that had shaped his post-war life was evident in the methodical way he approached their tactical situation, treating it as a problem that could be solved through proper planning and preparation. "The building has 3 potential entry points," he explained in a low voice, pointing out the main garage doors, the side entrance leading to his small apartment, and a rear exit that opened onto an alley behind the shop. "All of them are wired to a security system that will alert us if anyone tries to get in. The system also has a panic button that sends an automatic distress call to the state police dispatcher in Montpelier." Sarah appreciated his thoroughness, though she wondered whether local law enforcement would arrive in time to make a difference if North Point's people decided to abandon subtlety in favor of direct action. Corporate assassins with federal connections had ways of delaying or misdirecting police responses, as Marcus had discovered during the final weeks of his life. "What about communications?" she asked. "They'll be monitoring phone and internet traffic, looking for any indication of where I might be or who I might be contacting." Dave held up a small device that looked like a modified smartphone. "Military-grade encrypted communication unit. Uses satellite uplink instead of cellular towers, and the encryption is good enough that it would take NSA-level resources to crack it. I keep it for emergencies." "Where did you get something like that?" "Let's just say I maintained some friendships from my Army days," Dave replied diplomatically. "People who understand that certain kinds of equipment sometimes find useful civilian applications." Sarah decided not to pursue that line of inquiry further. Dave's military background was clearly more complex than he had initially revealed, and given her current situation, she was grateful for any advantages his previous experience might provide. The encrypted communicator represented their first real opportunity to reach out for help without alerting Sarah's pursuers to their plans. The question was who they could contact who would be both willing and able to provide meaningful assistance against an adversary with North Point Industries' resources and connections. "I need to access my secure files," Sarah said, indicating her laptop. "There might be someone in the evidence who could help us, someone with enough influence to take on a major defense contractor." Dave nodded and moved to ensure the garages window blinds were completely closed before Sarah opened her computer. The screen's glow seemed unnaturally bright in the dimmed workshop, and she was acutely aware that any light visible from outside could reveal their location to the surveillance team positioned at the diner. Sarah's fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency, navigating through multiple layers of encryption to access the files that had cost Marcus his life. The evidence against North Point Industries filled gigabytes of storage space, representing months of careful investigation into the company's systematic fraud. Financial records showed millions of dollars diverted from legitimate defense projects into offshore accounts controlled by executives. Technical reports documented the inferior materials and substandard manufacturing processes that compromised the safety of American military personnel. Communications between company officials revealed their awareness of the problems and their deliberate decision to continue supplying defective equipment rather than accept reduced profits. But buried within the financial data, Sarah found something that might represent hope rather than mere evidence of corruption. A series of wire transfers showed payments to congressional staffers, Pentagon procurement officials, and even federal judges who had ruled favorably on North Point's contract disputes. The breadth of the bribery network was staggering, but it also suggested potential allies among those who had refused North Point's corrupting influence. "Here," Sarah said, pointing to a series of encrypted emails between North Point executives and their Washington contacts. "Senator Elizabeth Warren's office has been investigating defense contract irregularities for 2 years. According to these communications, North Point considers her their biggest threat because she can't be bought or intimidated. Dave leaned over her shoulder to study the screen, his expression growing more serious as he absorbed the implications of what Sarah had discovered. Federal-level political protection, he murmured. That changes the tactical situation significantly. How so? If we can get this evidence to someone with Senator Warren's influence and credibility, North Point can't just make the problem disappear through assassination or intimidation. A Senate investigation with proper media attention becomes too public for them to handle through their usual methods. Sarah felt a stirring of genuine optimism for the first time since Marcus's death. You think she would actually act on this information? I think a senator who has built her reputation on holding corporations accountable for fraud would find it very difficult to ignore evidence of systematic corruption involving billions in defense spending, Dave replied. Especially if that evidence is presented properly and publicly enough that suppressing it would create more problems than addressing it. The strategy began to take shape in Sarah's mind. Instead of continuing to hide from North Point's hunters, they could go on the offensive by ensuring the evidence reached someone with enough power and visibility to make suppression impossible. The key would be timing and presentation, making sure the information became public knowledge before North Point could eliminate the witnesses or destroy the documentation. We'd have to get to Washington, Sarah said. And we'd have to do it without them tracking our movements or intercepting our communications. Actually, Dave said thoughtfully, I don't think we need to go to Washington at all. Warren maintains a district office in Burlington, and her staff there would have direct access to her Senate office resources. Burlington's only 90 minutes from here, and the route involves back roads that would be difficult for them to monitor effectively. The plan was elegant in its simplicity, but Sarah could see numerous points where things might go wrong. North Point's people would be expecting her to attempt some kind of escape from Millbrook, and they would have resources positioned to intercept her, regardless of which direction she traveled. The corporate surveillance team at the diner represented only the visible portion of a much larger operation designed to contain and eliminate her. They'll be watching all the main roads, she pointed out. And they probably have people positioned in Burlington as well, just in case I try to reach federal authorities. Dave's smile suggested he had already considered those obstacles and found them less insurmountable than they appeared. Ma'am, I spent 5 years moving through hostile territory where every road was watched and every contact was potentially compromised. The trick isn't to avoid detection entirely. The trick is to make sure that when they detect you, you're not where they expect you to be. Sarah waited for him to elaborate, but Dave had moved to a filing cabinet in his office and was retrieving what appeared to be topographical maps of central Vermont. He spread the largest map across his workbench, weighing down the corners with heavy wrenches, then began tracing routes with his finger. Main highways are definitely monitored, he said, indicating routes 4 and 100 on the map. But there's an old logging road that runs north from here through the Green Mountain National Forest. It connects to a network of seasonal roads that hunters and loggers use to access remote areas. Most of those roads aren't even marked on standard GPS systems. Would a vehicle make it through terrain like that? Not just any vehicle, Dave replied, then gestured toward the rear of the garage, where Sarah could see the outline of a large pickup truck covered by a canvas tarp. But I've got a modified Ford F-250 with specialized suspension and all-terrain capability. Built it myself for hunting trips, but it's more than capable of handling rough country. Sarah studied the map more carefully, noting the elevation changes and remote areas that Dave was proposing to traverse. The route would be slow and physically demanding, but it would also be virtually impossible for North Point's people to predict or monitor effectively. Corporate surveillance teams were equipped for urban environments and major transportation routes, not wilderness navigation through unmarked forest roads. How long would it take to reach Burlington using those back roads? 4 hours maybe. 5 depending on conditions, Dave replied. But we'd arrived there completely outside their surveillance network, with no electronic trail to indicate our route or timing. The plan was becoming more concrete, and Sarah found herself considering logistics and contingencies that would need to be addressed. Her ankle injury would make the rough journey uncomfortable, but it wouldn't prevent her from traveling. More importantly, they would need to ensure that the evidence reached Senator Warren's staff in a format that couldn't be dismissed or suppressed once North Point became aware of the leak. There's another consideration, Sarah said slowly. Once we deliver this evidence to federal authorities, North Point will know that their window for eliminating witnesses has closed. They'll probably abandon any pretense of subtlety and come at us with everything they have. Dave nodded as if he had expected this observation. Which is why we don't come back to Millbrook after we make contact with Warren's office. We keep moving, stay ahead of them until the investigation becomes public knowledge, and they can't risk making us disappear without creating more problems for themselves. Keep moving where? I've been running for 18 months, and they still found. M.E., you've been running alone, Dave corrected. Running scared, trying to disappear completely. That's a defensive strategy that only works as long as you can stay invisible. But once your location is compromised, defense becomes a losing game. Sarah studied his weathered face, noting the confidence in his voice despite the overwhelming odds they faced. There was something about Dave Coleman that suggested he had faced impossible situations before and found ways not just to survive them, but to prevail. What's the alternative to running? The alternative is making sure they have bigger problems to worry about than hunting you, Dave replied. Corporate assassins are effective against isolated targets who can't fight back effectively. They're a lot less effective against people who have federal protection and media attention. The plan made sense on paper, but Sarah had seen too many whistleblowers crushed by corporate backlash to put much faith in theories. North Point Industries had weathered past investigations and even congressional hearings using political influence to limit the fallout in deep pockets to smear or silence anyone who got too close. Even with Senator Warren's involvement, there was no certainty that the truth would lead to real consequences or that the people exposing it would survive the process. Dave must have picked up on her doubt. I'm not saying this will be easy, he said, or that we're guaranteed a win. I'm saying it's the best shot we've got to flip the script and stop playing defense. And if we fail? She asked. If they bury the investigation or bury us before the truth comes out? Dave's tone turned grim. Then at least we'll go down standing our ground, not running. Sometimes that's the only option. Left, Sarah took in his words. She recognized the mindset military thinking that prioritized action over fear. After a year and a half in hiding, constantly looking over her shoulder, the thought of finally pushing back, of doing something, was dangerously appealing, no matter the risks. A low growl of engines interrupted her thoughts. Vehicles crawling along Main Street. Dave went to the window, peeking through the blinds, his posture immediately shifting to one of quiet alertness. 3 vehicles, he said. Moving slow. Checking each building. They're expanding the search. Sarah's heart pounded. While they'd been laying out a plan, North Point's operatives have been tightening their net. How long before they reach us? She asked. Not long, Dave answered. They've already flagged me as an ally. That makes me a loose. And they'll want to tie off quickly. She grabbed her laptop and began organizing the files she needed, the evidence that could convince the senator's team of North Point's criminal activity. It was her only leverage. But it meant nothing if she didn't live long enough to deliver it. Meanwhile, Dave was uncovering a tarp from a pickup truck at the back of the garage. Even in the low light, Sarah could tell this wasn't an ordinary vehicle. Oversized tires, reinforced frame, multiple fuel tanks. It was clearly built for serious terrain and extended travel, not a hunting rig. Something closer to a mobile survival platform. "Take what you absolutely can't leave behind," he said, firing up the engine. The deep rumble echoed through the garage. Sarah winced at the pain in her ankle as she limped toward the passenger side, her bag slung over her shoulder. She managed to climb in as Dave approached a control panel and keyed in a code. The rear garage door began rising smoothly, revealing a narrow alley behind the shop. At the same time, the lights on a few discrete cameras flickered to life, part of an automated defense system. "They'll hear that engine," Sarah said. "They'll hear something," Dave acknowledged. "But by the time they figure out where it came from, we'll be miles away, somewhere their rentals won't follow." The garage door finished opening, revealing a side street that bypassed the areas North Point had locked down. Dave had planned for this. They weren't escaping, they were executing a withdrawal under pressure. Sarah noticed more equipment inside. The truck, radios, navigation tools, and what looked like survival gear. The setup was professional military grade. "Dave," she asked as he guided the truck into the alley, "who were you before all this?" He gave a faint smile, his face lit by the dash. "Let's just say I used to be very good at finding people who didn't want to be found, and helping others disappear when they needed a second chance." She was still processing that when gunfire shattered the back window of the garage. North Point had dropped the pretense. They were done with subtlety. Dave didn't flinch. He accelerated smoothly, the truck powering down the alley even as automatic weapons barked behind them. "Hold on," he said calmly. "It's about to get interesting." Sarah gripped the door and braced herself. Interesting from a man like Dave probably meant something between a high-speed chase and open combat. Out the rear window, she caught glimpses of muzzle flashes lighting up the night. North Point's strike team realizing too late that their targets were slipping away into terrain they couldn't control. The truck turned onto a dark residential street and climbed toward the tree-covered hills surrounding Millbrook. Dave drove without headlights, navigating by moonlight and muscle memory. Within minutes, they were deep in the Vermont woods, leaving the town in North Point's reach behind. "Now we find out," Dave said as the truck started climbing a narrow dirt road lined with towering pines, "whether your enemies are as good at this game as they think they are." For the first time since Marcus was killed, Sarah didn't feel like she was running. She was being led by someone who understood the enemy's tactics, who could anticipate their moves. Someone who had the skills and tools to turn the tables. Whether they'd make it to Senator Warren's office or whether the system would ever hold North Point accountable remained unknown, but she wasn't alone anymore. And for the first time, it felt like they had a fighting chance. As the truck climbed into the wilderness, it carried more than just two fugitives. It carried the truth and the possibility, however slim, that justice might still be possible in a world built to protect the powerful. Behind them, the lights of Millbrook faded into darkness as Sarah Mitchell and Dave Coleman disappeared into the mountains, carrying with them the information that could destroy one of America's largest defense contractors. The hunt that had begun 18 months earlier with Marcus's assassination was entering its final phase, and this time, the prey was prepared to fight back. The dirt road wound upward through dense forest for nearly an hour before Dave finally allowed himself to use the truck's headlights. They had climbed high enough into the mountains that the lights of any pursuing vehicles would be visible miles below them, and the narrow trail they were following would be impossible to navigate in complete darkness. Sarah had remained silent during the ascent, gripping the dashboard as the modified pickup navigated switchbacks and steep grades that would have challenged most civilian vehicles. "They're not following us," Dave said, checking the rearview mirror for the dozenth time since leaving Millbrook. "Either they can't find the trail we took, or they're smart enough to realize their rental cars won't make it up this terrain." Sarah allowed herself to relax slightly, though the adrenaline from their escape continued to course through her system. "How long before they figure out we're heading toward Burlington?" "They might never figure it out," Dave replied, downshifting. as they approached another steep climb. This route takes us through 3 different counties and connects to dozens of possible destinations. Even if they correctly guess that we're trying to reach federal authorities, they'll have to cover Vermont's entire congressional delegation. Both senators' offices, the FBI field office, and the U.S. Attorney's office. Unless they have enough resources to watch all of those locations simultaneously. Dave's expression grew thoughtful as he considered the implications of facing an adversary with virtually unlimited funding. North Point's budget might be big enough to hire that many contractors, but coordination becomes a problem when you're trying to monitor multiple locations across several cities. The more people they deploy, the more likely they are to attract official attention. Sarah hoped he was right, but 18 months of being hunted had taught her to expect the worst-case scenario in any tactical situation. North Point Industries had demonstrated remarkable persistence and resources in tracking her movements, and she doubted they would abandon their pursuit simply because she had temporarily evaded their immediate surveillance. The logging road crested a ridge and began descending toward a valley where Sarah could see lights scattered among the trees. According to Dave's topographical map, they were approaching the outskirts of Waterbury, a small city that served as a regional center for central Vermont. From there, they would be able to access better roads for the final approach to Burlington, while still avoiding the main highways where North Point's people would be watching for them. "There's something I need to tell you before we reach Senator Warren's office," Dave said as they descended toward the valley floor. "My military service wasn't entirely conventional. I worked for a unit that officially doesn't exist, handling situations that required capabilities beyond what regular Army personnel could provide." Sarah had suspected that Dave's background involved more than routine military service, given his tactical knowledge and the sophisticated equipment he had access to. "Special operations? Something like that. The important thing is that I still have contacts in the intelligence community, people who owe me favors from operations we conducted together. If this situation with North Point escalates beyond what Senator Warren can handle politically, we might be able to access resources that go beyond normal civilian law enforcement." "You're talking about calling in people who work outside legal channels?" Dave nodded grimly. "Sometimes corporate power becomes so entrenched that conventional approaches to justice aren't sufficient. When that happens, you need people who understand that national security sometimes requires taking action that won't appear in any official reports." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension at this revelation. The prospect of having allies with intelligence community connections was encouraging, but it also suggested that their conflict with North Point might escalate into something approaching a covert war between corporate interests and government operatives. Either way, she was no longer facing the corporation's unlimited resources with only her technical skills and Dave's mechanical expertise. They reached the outskirts of Waterbury without encountering any sign of surveillance or pursuit. Dave navigated through residential neighborhoods until they reached Route 100, a main north-south highway that would carry them to Burlington in less than an hour. The transition from wilderness roads to paved highways felt like emerging from hiding into vulnerability, and Sarah found herself scanning every vehicle they passed for signs of hostile intent. "Relax," Dave said, noting her tension. "We're just—" Another pickup truck on a Vermont highway at 3 o'clock in the morning. Nothing unusual about that during hunting season. Sarah tried to follow his advice, but the paranoia that had kept her alive for 18 months wasn't easily suppressed. Every passing car represented a potential threat, every roadside stop a possible ambush point. The relative security of the mountain wilderness was behind them now, and they were entering territory where North Point's resources and connections would be most effective. Burlington appeared ahead of them as a cluster of lights along the eastern shore of Lake Champlain, Vermont's largest city and home to the University of Vermont. Even in the pre-dawn hours, the metropolitan area showed signs of activity as shift. Workers, early commuters, and students maintained the steady pulse of urban life. Senator Warren's district office was located downtown, in a federal building that also housed other congressional representatives and various government agencies. Dave parked the truck several blocks away from their destination, choosing a spot near the university campus where the vehicle would blend in with other pickup trucks belonging to students and staff. The walk to the federal building would give them an opportunity to assess the area for surveillance while maintaining the appearance of pedestrians going about routine morning business. Sarah's ankle had stiffened during the long drive, and walking was more painful than she had expected. Dave noticed her discomfort and adjusted their pace accordingly, but she knew they couldn't afford to appear obviously injured if North Point's people were watching for them in the downtown area. The building doesn't open until 8 o'clock, Dave observed, checking his watch as they approached the federal complex. We need to find a place to wait that provides good visibility but doesn't make us obvious targets. They settled on a coffee shop across the street from the government building, a 24-hour establishment that catered to hospital workers from the nearby University of Vermont Medical Center. The early morning clientele consisted primarily of nurses ending night shifts and medical residents fortifying themselves with caffeine before beginning long days in the hospital. Sarah and Dave blended easily into the tired, purposeful atmosphere of people whose work involved life and death. Responsibilities. Sarah ordered coffee and a breakfast sandwich she didn't particularly want, while Dave positioned himself at a window table that provided clear sight lines to the federal building's entrances. His casual surveillance was professional and obtrusive, but Sarah could see him cataloging details about pedestrian traffic patterns, vehicle movements, and potential defensive positions. "Anything concerning?" she asked, settling into the chair beside him. "3 vehicles that don't belong to the normal morning pattern," Dave replied quietly. Black sedan parked on Church Street, SUV in the federal building's visitor lot, and a van that's made 2 passes down Main Street in the last 15 minutes. Sarah felt her stomach tighten with familiar anxiety. North Point's people had correctly anticipated their destination and were already in position to intercept them when they attempted to reach Senator Warren's staff. The trap that had been set in Millbrook was being reconstructed in Burlington with more resources and better preparation. How many people are we talking about? Hard to say without closer observation, but probably a dozen minimum. Enough to cover all the building's exits and maintain surveillance on the surrounding area. Sarah considered their options, none of which seemed particularly encouraging. They could abort the mission and attempt to reach federal authorities through a different channel, but that would only delay the inevitable confrontation while giving North Point more time to strengthen their position. Alternatively, they could proceed with their original plan and hope that Dave's tactical skills would be sufficient to get them past corporate security contractors. "There's a third option," Dave said, apparently following her thoughts. "We call in some of those intelligence community contacts I mentioned. People who specialize in situations where hostile forces are trying to prevent American citizens from reaching their elected representatives. How quickly could they respond? Depends on who's available and what other operations they're committed." "2," Dave replied, pulling out the encrypted communication device he had shown her at the garage. "But some of these people owe me enough that they'd drop whatever they're doing to help, especially if they understand what's at stake." Sarah watched Dave compose a message on the military-grade device, his fingers moving quickly across the specialized keyboard. The communication was brief and coded, but she could see that he was requesting immediate assistance for a situation involving corporate interference with federal whistleblower procedures. Within minutes, a response appeared on the screen. "Help is on the way," Dave said with satisfaction. "Estimated arrival in 45 minutes. What kind of help?" "The kind that makes corporate security contractors reconsider whether they're being paid enough to interfere with national security investigations." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension at the prospect of involving federal operatives in their conflict with North Point. On one hand, professional intelligence assets would level the playing field significantly and provide protection that civilian law enforcement couldn't match. On the other hand, escalating their situation to the level of covert operations suggested that the stakes were higher than she had fully understood. They waited in the coffee shop as Burlington slowly awakened around them. Morning commuters began filling the streets, hospital staff rotated shifts, and early joggers appeared along the lakefront paths. The federal building showed signs of activity as security guards arrived and maintenance personnel prepared for another day of routine government business. To casual observers, it was a perfectly normal autumn morning in Vermont's largest city. But Sarah could see the subtle signs of hostile surveillance that Dave had identified. The black sedan's occupants remained motionless behind tinted windows. The SUV in the visitor lot hadn't moved since their arrival, and the van continued its periodic circuits through the downtown area. North Point's people were professional and patient, prepared to maintain their watch until their targets emerged from whatever temporary shelter they had found. At 7:30, Dave received another message on his encrypted communicator. "They're in position," he announced quietly. "Time to see whether North Point's contractors are as good as they think they are." Sarah gathered her messenger bag and prepared to leave the coffee shop, though she had no idea what assistance Dave's contacts might have provided or how they planned to neutralize the corporate surveillance network. As they approached the exit, she noticed that the morning pedestrian traffic had increased significantly, with more people than usual moving purposefully along the sidewalks surrounding the federal building. "Those are your people?" she asked, noting the subtle coordination among several apparently unrelated individuals. "Some of them," Dave replied with a slight smile. "The others are just ordinary citizens who happen to receive anonymous tips about suspicious activity near a government building." Amazing how quickly concerned citizens can mobilize when they think domestic security might be threatened. Sarah realized that Dave's intelligence contacts had orchestrated something far more sophisticated than a simple protective escort. By flooding the area with both covert operatives and genuinely concerned civilians, they had created enough confusion and activity to mask Sarah and Dave's approach to the federal building while simultaneously drawing official attention to North Point's surveillance operation. They left the coffee shop and joined the stream of pedestrians moving toward the government complex. Sarah couldn't identify which of the people around them were intelligence operatives and which were ordinary Burlington residents, but the effect was exactly what Dave had promised. The corporate contractors in their vehicles found themselves surrounded by too many potential targets to monitor effectively, while their presence became increasingly obvious to the growing number of people in the area. A Burlington Police Department cruiser appeared at the intersection of Church and Main Streets, its presence prompting the black sedan to start its engine and begin moving away from the federal building. The SUV in the visitor lot remained in position, but Sarah could see its occupants speaking urgently into radio devices as they tried to coordinate their response to the unexpected complications. Dave guided Sarah toward the federal building's main entrance, moving confidently through the crowd of people who seemed to be converging on the area from multiple directions. As they climbed the steps to the entrance, Sarah caught sight of the surveillance van accelerating away from downtown, its occupants apparently deciding that discretion was preferable to continued observation under such public circumstances. The building's security checkpoint was staffed by Federal Protective Service officers, who seemed unusually alert for a routine morning shift. Dave approached them with the kind of confident bearing that suggested official business, presenting identification that Sarah hadn't seen before. "Dave Coleman, Military Intelligence Liaison," he said to the senior guard. "We have an appointment with Senator Warren's staff regarding a matter of national security importance." The guard examined Dave's credentials carefully, then consulted a list on his desk. "Yes, sir. Ms. Jennifer Hayes from the senator's office is expecting you. 6th floor, suite 612. Sarah realized that Dave's contacts had done more than provide tactical support for their approach to the building. They had also arranged for official recognition and access, ensuring that Senator Warren's staff would be prepared to receive them and take their evidence seriously. The elevator ride to the 6th floor gave Sarah an opportunity to consider how dramatically their situation had changed since the previous evening. Less than 12 hours earlier, she had been a fugitive hiding in a small-town auto repair shop, facing corporate assassins with nothing but her technical skills and a concealed pistol. Now she was entering a United States Senator's office with federal protection and intelligence community backing, carrying evidence that could destroy one of America's largest defense contractors. Suite 612 was a modest collection of offices that reflected the practical nature of a district operation rather than the prestige of a Washington headquarters. The reception area was staffed by a young woman who appeared to be expecting them despite the early hour and unusual circumstances. "Mr. Coleman, Miss Mitchell," she said, rising from her desk. "I'm Jennifer Hayes, Senator Warren's district director. I understand you have information regarding defense contractor irregularities that require immediate attention." Sarah felt a surge of optimism at the professional and serious tone of the meeting. Senator Warren's staff had been briefed on their situation and were prepared to take action based on the evidence she had risked her life to preserve. The corporate power that had seemed insurmountable just hours earlier was about to face federal legislative oversight backed by criminal investigation authority. "Ms. Hayes," Sarah said, opening her messenger bag to retrieve the encrypted files that contained Northpoint's systematic fraud documentation. "What I'm about to show you will require Senate investigation, FBI criminal referral, and witness protection. Resources. Northpoint Industries has been defrauding the Department of Defense for years while eliminating anyone who threatens to expose their operations." Jennifer Hayes gestured for them to follow her into a secure conference room equipped with computer terminals and communication equipment that seemed unusually sophisticated for a district congressional office. As Sarah began uploading her evidence files to the senator's secure servers, she realized that the long nightmare of running from corporate assassins was finally approaching its end. The question now was whether federal investigation and prosecution would be sufficient to neutralize Northpoint's threat permanently, or whether the company's extensive connections would enable them to survive even congressional scrutiny and criminal charges. Either way, Sarah Mitchell was no longer facing the threat alone, and the evidence that had cost Marcus's life was finally reaching the people with authority to act on it. Dave positioned himself near the conference room window, maintaining watch over the street below while Sarah worked with Senator Warren's staff to organize the massive collection of financial records, communications, and technical documentation. His military bearing and obvious tactical awareness seemed to reassure the congressional staffers that their witness was under adequate protection, despite the dangerous nature of her revelations. "This is extraordinary," Jennifer Hayes said as she reviewed the scope of Northpoint's criminal enterprise. "Senator Warren will want to personally review this evidence before we proceed with formal hearings, but I can tell you that this documentation appears to support criminal referrals on multiple federal charges." Sarah felt a weight lifting from her shoulders that she hadn't realized she was carrying. After 18 months of paranoia and isolation, the evidence that had destroyed her previous life was finally being treated with the seriousness it deserved by people with the authority and resources to act on it effectively. The hunt that had begun with Marcus's assassination was entering its final phase, but this time, the corporate predators would discover that their prey had found protectors willing and able to turn the tables on them permanently. Senator Elizabeth Warren's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to confronting corporate power when she joined the conference call from Washington 3 hours after Sarah had finished uploading the North Point evidence files. The senator had reviewed the preliminary summary prepared by her staff, and her questions demonstrated both the thoroughness of someone who understood complex financial fraud and the anger of someone who took defense contract corruption personally. "Ms. Mitchell," the senator said through the secure video connection, "I want you to understand that what you've provided goes beyond typical whistleblower complaints. This evidence documents systematic betrayal of our military personnel and theft of taxpayer resources on a scale that demands immediate criminal prosecution." Sarah felt a mixture of vindication and residual fear as she responded to the senators' questions about technical details and timeline elements. Even with federal protection and congressional attention, 18 months of being hunted had left her wary of assuming that any victory over North Point Industries would be permanent or complete. "Senator," Sarah said carefully, "North Point has connections throughout the defense establishment and intelligence community. They've demonstrated willingness to eliminate witnesses through assassination disguised as accidents. I'm concerned that even congressional investigation might not be sufficient to neutralize their threat to people who challenge their operations." Senator Warren's expression hardened perceptibly. "Ms. Mitchell, I've been fighting corporate corruption for decades, and I've learned that sunlight is the most effective disinfectant. North Point's power depends on operating in shadows and maintaining plausible deniability. Once their crimes become public knowledge through formal hearings, their ability to intimidate witnesses or suppress evidence disappears." Dave, who had remained quietly watchful throughout the meeting with congressional staff, stepped forward to address the video screen directly. "Senator, with respect, corporate assassination capabilities don't disappear just because congressional hearings make them politically inconvenient. Miss Mitchell will need long-term protection that goes beyond what normal witness security programs can provide." "Mr. Coleman, I understand you have specialized experience in these matters," Senator Warren replied, obviously having been briefed on Dave's background. "What level of protection are we discussing?" "Complete identity reconstruction, relocation to a secure environment, and ongoing surveillance detection until North Point's leadership is convicted and imprisoned," Dave said without hesitation. "Anything less than that leaves Ms. Mitchell vulnerable to retaliation once media attention moves on to other stories." Jennifer Hayes, who had been coordinating between the Washington office and the Burlington meeting, spoke up from her position at the conference table. "Senator, we've already initiated contact with the U.S. Marshal Service regarding witness protection protocols. They're prepared to provide comprehensive security starting immediately." Sarah realized that Senator Warren's staff had been working behind the scenes throughout their morning meeting, coordinating with federal law enforcement agencies and preparing for a rapid escalation of her whistleblower complaint into formal criminal investigation. The machinery of federal justice was already mobilizing around the evidence she had risked her life to preserve. "There's another consideration," Sarah said, glancing at Dave before continuing. "My partner Marcus was killed because North Point discovered he was planning to expose their fraud. If congressional hearings proceed without addressing the company's assassination capabilities, other potential witnesses might be eliminated before they can testify." Senator Warren leaned forward on the video screen, her expression conveying both understanding and determination. "Ms. Mitchell, that's exactly why we're going to move quickly and publicly on this investigation. North Point's ability to silence witnesses depends on maintaining the fiction that their victims died accidentally. Once we establish a pattern of suspicious deaths connected to their operations, those tactics become counterproductive because additional deaths would only strengthen the case against them." The senator's strategic thinking was sound, but Sarah couldn't shake the memory of Marcus's confidence that exposure would protect him from corporate retaliation. North Point had demonstrated remarkable sophistication in arranging his death to look accidental, and their resources might be sufficient to eliminate additional witnesses regardless of congressional attention. Dave seemed to understand her continuing anxiety. Senator, I'd like to suggest a parallel approach that might provide additional security for Miss Mitchell and deterrence against future witness intimidation. What did you have in mind, Mr. Coleman? Dead man switch protocols. Dave replied with the calm professionalism of someone who had planned such contingencies before. Complete evidence packages distributed to multiple secure locations, with automatic release mechanisms if anything happens to key witnesses. North Point's executives might be willing to risk killing isolated whistleblowers, but they won't risk triggering evidence releases that would guarantee their destruction. Senator Warren considered this suggestion with obvious approval. That's excellent thinking, Mr. Coleman. My staff can coordinate with the FBI to establish those protocols immediately. Sarah felt her anxiety beginning to ease as she realized that her situation was being handled by people who understood both the scope of North Point's threat and the resources necessary to counter it effectively. For the first time since Marcus's death, she could envision a future where she wouldn't be constantly looking over her shoulder for corporate assassins. Senator, she said, what timeline are we looking at for hearings and prosecution? Formal. Senate hearings within 6 weeks, Senator Warren replied promptly. FBI criminal investigation is already underway based on the evidence you provided this morning. Justice Department prosecution should begin within 90 days, assuming their review confirms what we've already seen. The speed of the federal response was both encouraging and somewhat overwhelming. Sarah had spent 18 months believing that her evidence would never reach the proper authorities, and now she was discovering that those authorities were prepared to act with remarkable efficiency once they understood the scope of North Point's criminal enterprise. Jennifer Hayes closed her laptop and addressed Sarah directly. Ms. Mitchell, you'll be transferred to federal custody within the hour. U.S. Marshals will handle your security while the FBI processes your evidence and prepares for prosecution. You'll have secure communication access to stay informed about the investigation's progress. What about Dave? Sarah asked, suddenly realizing that her alliance with the small-town mechanic might be ending, now that federal authorities had assumed responsibility for her protection. Dave's expression suggested he had been expecting this question. Ma'am, my job was getting you safely to people who could act on your evidence. That mission is complete. But North Point knows you helped me escape. They might retaliate against you even after I'm in federal custody. Senator Warren's voice interrupted their exchange. Mr. Coleman, I'd like to discuss potential consulting arrangements with my office. Your tactical expertise and intelligence contacts could be valuable assets for our investigation, especially if North Point attempts to intimidate other witnesses or interfere with congressional proceedings. Dave considered the offer with obvious interest. Senator, I'd be honored to assist with your investigation in any capacity you find useful. Sarah felt a surge of relief that her partnership with Dave wouldn't end simply because federal authorities had taken over her protection. His combination of tactical skills and ethical commitment had already proven invaluable, and Senator Warren was clearly smart enough to recognize those qualities. The video conference concluded with detailed scheduling for Sarah's transition to federal custody and Dave's integration into the congressional investigation team. As the secure connection closed, Sarah found herself alone with Dave for what might be their final private conversation before the machinery of federal justice separated them into different roles. Thank you, she said simply, knowing that words were inadequate for what he had risked to help her. Ma'am, Dave replied with the slight smile that had become familiar during their brief but intense partnership. You warned me you'd bring trouble. Turned out to be exactly the kind of trouble I'd been looking for. 2 federal marshals arrived at the Burlington office 30 minutes later, professional and courteous, but clearly prepared for the possibility that North Point might attempt to interfere with Sarah's transfer to secure custody. Their presence represented the full authority of the United States government, a level of protection that corporate assassins would find difficult to challenge directly. As Sarah prepared to leave with her federal escorts, Dave handed her a small device similar to the encrypted communicator he had used to contact his intelligence assets. Secure communication link, he explained. In case you need to reach someone who understands how to handle corporate retaliation outside official channels. Sarah understood the implication. Even with congressional protection and FBI investigation, there might be situations where North Point's resources and connections required responses that couldn't be documented in official reports. Dave's offer represented insurance against scenarios that formal law enforcement might not be able to address. Effectively, the federal courthouse in Burlington served as the initial staging area for Sarah's entry into witness protection, a secure facility where she could provide detailed testimony to FBI agents while remaining under constant protection. The building's federal security meant that any attempt by North Point to reach her would require confronting armed federal officers, a level of escalation that would attract far more official attention than corporate executives could tolerate. Over the following weeks, Sarah watched from secure custody as Senator Warren's investigation gained momentum and media attention. Congressional hearings revealed the full scope of North Point's fraud to television audiences across the country, while FBI raids on company facilities produced additional evidence that strengthened the criminal case. Dave's strategic insight proved valuable, as he helped congressional staff anticipate and counter North Point's attempts to discredit witnesses and suppress damaging revelations. The defense contractor that had seemed invincible during Sarah's months of hiding began collapsing under the weight of federal investigation and public scrutiny. Executive resignations, contract cancellations, and criminal indictments followed in rapid succession as North Point discovered that their political connections couldn't protect them from evidence of systematic fraud and witness intimidation. Marcus's death was officially reclassified as homicide after FBI investigation revealed evidence of corporate assassination disguised as automotive accident. Additional suspicious deaths connected to North Point's operations prompted a broader investigation that exposed a network of contract killers operating under corporate security cover. The revelation that a major defense contractor had been murdering American citizens to protect fraudulent profits generated outrage that transcended normal political divisions. 6 months after Sarah's desperate escape from Millbrook, she testified before packed Senate hearing rooms as cameras broadcast her words to audiences that numbered in the millions. The evidence she had risked her life to preserve was finally receiving the attention it deserved, and North Point Industries was facing consequences that would permanently end their ability to threaten witnesses or defraud the government. The final phase of Sarah's transformation from hunted whistleblower to protected witness occurred when the FBI's cryptocurrency forensics team successfully traced and recovered the reward money that represented her financial independence. $180,000, plus additional damages recovered through civil litigation, provided the foundation for a new life free from both corporate retaliation and financial desperation. Dave's role in the investigation evolved from tactical consultant to permanent staff member of Senator Warren's Oversight Committee, a position that utilized his unique combination of military experience and ethical commitment. His small town auto repair shop in Millbrook became the headquarters for a private security consulting firm that specialized in protecting whistleblowers and corporate fraud investigators. When Sarah emerged from witness protection 18 months later, North Point Industries no longer existed as a functional corporation. Its executives were serving federal prison sentences, its defense contracts had been terminated, and its assets had been liquidated to compensate the victims of their fraud. The threat that had dominated Sarah's life for nearly 3 years had been permanently eliminated through the kind of systematic investigation and prosecution that corporate criminals feared most. The reunion between Sarah and Dave took place, not in a courtroom or government office, but in a coffee shop near the University of Vermont campus, where they had once waited for dawn while planning their approach to federal authorities. Both had changed during their separation, shaped by experiences that had tested their courage and confirmed their commitment to justice over personal safety. "So," Dave said as they settled into the same window table where they had once watched, "for corporate surveillance, any regrets about bringing me all that trouble?" Sarah's smile reflected the confidence of someone who had discovered that, standing up to seemingly impossible odds, could actually succeed when approached with proper planning and adequate allies. "None at all," she replied. "Though I have to admit, I never expected good trouble to be quite so complicated." "Ma'am," Dave responded with the grin that had sustained them both through their darkest moments, "the best kind of trouble usually is." Outside the coffee shop windows, Burlington continued its routine morning activities, but Sarah knew that their successful challenge to corporate power had changed more than just their personal circumstances. North Point's destruction had sent a message throughout the defense industry that systematic fraud and witness intimidation would no longer be tolerated, while their investigation had strengthened federal capabilities for protecting whistleblowers and prosecuting corporate criminals. The woman who had once stepped off a Greyhound bus seeking sanctuary in a fabricated job opportunity had become someone who helped reshape the relationship between corporate power and democratic accountability. The man who had spent years repairing other people's vehicles while searching for meaningful purpose had found a calling that utilized his skills in service of principles that transcended individual profit. Together, they had proven that courage and competence could still prevail against opponents who possessed greater resources but lacked the moral authority that came with defending rather than exploiting the systems that protected American democracy. The trouble that Sarah had warned about bringing had indeed transformed both their lives, but in ways that neither had anticipated when their partnership began with a desperate plea for help in a small town auto repair shop. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.